went missing between July of 2007 and September of 2010. For the next 13 years, their cases went unsolved. Until today.
Rex Heuermann
is now in custody.
Gilgo Beach has been used to discard human remains for some time.
This is the perfect place to dump a body.
They found another one.
3 more really scared me.
Body count. People in our area are starting to get nervous.
We're anxious to have this over with.
And that's when I remember the police commissioner saying for the first time the word serial killer.
We could have a serial killer.
Her last phone call was to 911.
If not for Shannan Gilbert, these women would not have been found.
Find this killer before he strikes and hurts and murders someone you love.
He believes the killer is likely still in the area.
What has Rex Heuermann been doing all this time?
Likely following the police department's every move.
He had over 200 searches pertaining to the Gilgo investigation.
It really makes me wonder, was he watching us?
This guy made a mistake somewhere. He said someday that they'll figure.
Night had already swallowed the quiet beach community when the call came in. A woman's voice, panicked, breathless, whispering and shouting at the same time. She kept saying the same thing over and over. Someone was trying to kill her. Dispatchers struggled to understand what was happening on the other end of the line. The connection was chaotic. Footsteps, heavy breathing, doors slamming somewhere in the distance. The caller was a 24-year-old woman named Shannan Gilbert. And in the early hours of May 1st, 2010, she was running for her life. Somewhere inside a quiet, gated neighborhood called Oak Beach, residents were asleep behind locked doors, while a terrified woman pounded on houses, begging for help. The 911 call lasted more than 20 minutes. But what happened during those 20 minutes would become one of the most haunting mysteries in modern true crime. Because somewhere in the darkness, Shannan vanished. No witnesses, no clear explanation, just the sound of panic fading into the night. When police arrived, she was gone. Search teams combed the area for days, then weeks. But the marshes surrounding Oak Beach are thick, silent, and unforgiving. And eventually, the search for Shannan Gilbert began to fade into another missing person case. Or at least, that's what investigators thought. Months later, in December of 2010, police returned to search the remote stretch of brush and sand along Gilgo Beach. They weren't expecting to find anything, but as a cadaver dog moved slowly through the tall grass along Ocean Parkway, it suddenly stopped. Then, it started digging. Officers moved closer. At first, they thought they had found the remains of Shannan Gilbert, but the body they uncovered wasn't Shannan. And it wasn't the only one. Because hidden along that lonely highway, investigators were about to uncover something far more disturbing. A secret burial ground. One that would expose a killer who had been hunting in the shadows for years. A killer who, for more than a decade, managed to hide in plain sight. And the truth about what happened along Gilgo Beach would soon unravel into one of the most chilling serial murder investigations in American history. But before we go further into this case, welcome to Crime Case Examiner. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our deep investigations into the world's most disturbing true crime cases. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The search along Ocean Parkway had started as routine. Officers were combing through thick brush and tall grass along the isolated stretch of roadway that cuts through the barrier islands of Long Island. The area was quiet in the winter months. Cold wind pushed through the dunes, and the empty roadways felt almost abandoned. Police officer John Malia walked slowly beside his cadaver dog, Blue. The trained dog had already worked countless search operations before, but this time something felt different. The dog suddenly slowed, then stopped. Blue began to circle a patch of brush. Then the dog started digging. Malia stepped closer, pushing branches aside. At first, the shape beneath the leaves looked like debris, but as officers began clearing the area, the truth emerged. They had found human remains. The remains belonged to a young woman named Melissa Barthelemy. Melissa had disappeared the previous year in July 2009. She had been working as an escort and had traveled to New York from the Bronx to meet a client. After that meeting, she was never seen alive again. Now, more than a year later, her body had been discovered in a place few people ever passed through on foot. But the discovery did not stop there. Within days, search teams returned to the same stretch of Ocean Parkway. The narrow road cuts between marshland and the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by dense brush that makes it almost impossible to see what lies beneath the surface. One by one, more remains were uncovered. Another body. Then another. And then another. Their investigators soon realized that Melissa Barthelemy was not the only victim hidden along that lonely road. Within a quarter-mile of where Melissa had been found, police uncovered the remains of 3 additional women: Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Maureen Brainard-Barnes. Each discovery added another layer of dread to the investigation. All 4 women had vanished after arranging meetings with clients. Each had advertised escort services online. Each had been in her 20s, and each had been carefully wrapped in burlap before being left along the side of Ocean Parkway. The pattern was impossible to ignore. These were not random killings. The victims had been placed deliberately in the same area, hidden just far enough from the road to avoid being seen by passing cars, yet close enough for someone familiar with the terrain to access quickly. Investigators began referring to the victims as the Gilgo Four, and as the evidence mounted, a chilling realization began to spread through law enforcement. A serial killer had been operating along the south shore of Long Island for years. But one detail in the case would soon stand out as especially disturbing. It involved Melissa Barthelemy. After Melissa disappeared, her younger sister began receiving phone calls. At first, the family believed it might be Melissa trying to reach them. But the voice on the other end of the line did not belong to her. The caller spoke calmly, coldly. He did not sound afraid. He sounded amused. Over the course of several weeks, the caller used Melissa's own phone to contact her sister multiple times. During those calls, he made disturbing comments about Melissa's death, describing details that only the killer could have known. The calls were brief, sometimes lasting only seconds. But each time investigators tried to trace them, the same pattern appeared. The signal came from busy locations in Manhattan, Times Square, Midtown, crowded streets where thousands of people passed every hour. Whoever was making those calls understood how to hide. The killer wasn't just violent. He was methodical, and he was confident enough to taunt the victim's own family. As the months passed, investigators widened their search along Ocean Parkway. In early 2011, teams began combing miles of marshland, dunes, and brush along the barrier island. What they discovered next only deepened the horror of the case. Now, additional remains began appearing in areas not far from where the Gilgo Four had been found. Some were skeletal, some had been buried longer, and some told investigators that the killings might stretch much further back in time than anyone first believed. Among the remains were those of a woman named Jessica Taylor. Jessica had disappeared years earlier. Parts of her body had previously been discovered in a wooded area in Manorville on Long Island in 2003. At the time, investigators believed the case was unrelated to any other killings. Now, more remains belonging to Jessica had been found near Ocean Parkway. Soon after, investigators made another connection. Another victim whose partial remains had been found years earlier in Manorville was now linked to the Gilgo Beach area. Her name was Valerie Mack, just like Jessica Taylor, and parts of her body had been discovered in Manorville long before the Gilgo Beach search began. but the rest of her remains were now located along Ocean Parkway. The discoveries revealed something investigators had not initially expected. The killer may have used multiple dumping grounds over many years. Manorville, located deeper on Long Island, appeared to be one site. Ocean Parkway appeared to be another. This suggested the killer had familiarity with large areas of Long Island and had been operating long before the Gilgo Four disappeared. As investigators continued searching the region, they uncovered even more disturbing discoveries. Among the remains was an unidentified victim who quickly became known in the investigation as the Asian Doe. The skeletal remains belonged to a young person believed to be between 17 and 23 years old. Investigators determined that the victim had been biologically male but had been dressed in women's clothing. Despite years of investigation and multiple attempts to identify the individual, the victim's name remains unknown. Another case soon emerged that puzzled investigators even further. Remains belonging to a woman and a small child were discovered in separate locations along the coastline. For years, the woman was known only by a nickname investigators gave her: Peaches. The name came from a tattoo found on her body depicting a peach with a bite taken out of it. Her identity remained unknown for nearly 3 decades, but advances in genetic genealogy eventually changed that. In 2025, our investigators finally identified the woman as Tanya Denise Jackson. Her young daughter, whose remains had been discovered years earlier in a different location, was identified as Tatiana Marie Dykes. For a moment, it appeared the Gilgo Beach serial killer may have claimed yet another victim. But the case took a shocking turn. Later that same year, authorities arrested the child's father in connection with the murders. The evidence suggested that the deaths of Tanya Denise Jackson and her daughter were not connected to the serial killer operating along Ocean Parkway. The Gilgo Beach investigation was becoming increasingly complicated. Some victims were clearly connected, others were not, and investigators were struggling to separate one killer's crimes from another's. Meanwhile, and the case that had started it all still lingered over the investigation: Shannan Gilbert. For more than a year after she vanished, her family searched for answers. Then, in December 2011, nearly 19 months after she disappeared, search teams discovered human remains in a marshy area near Oak Beach. The remains were confirmed to be Shannan Gilbert. Authorities concluded that she had likely drowned after becoming disoriented while running through the wetlands that night. But the ruling immediately sparked controversy. An independent autopsy commissioned by her family raised the possibility that Shannan may have been strangled. Her family insisted she had been murdered. Investigators remained divided. Some believed her death was a tragic accident. Others suspected she may have crossed paths with the same killer responsible for the bodies along Ocean Parkway. To this day, the question remains unanswered. As the number of victims grew, the investigation itself began to fracture. Different law enforcement agencies argued over jurisdiction and control of the case. Communication between departments became strained, and then another scandal erupted. The police chief of Suffolk County, James Burke, became the subject of a federal investigation unrelated to the murders. In 2016, Burke was convicted and sentenced to prison after admitting to assaulting a suspect and attempting to cover it up. The scandal sent shockwaves through the department. It also damaged cooperation between local police and federal investigators. And many observers later believed the conflict slowed the Gilgo Beach investigation at a critical time. For years afterward, the case seemed frozen. The victims remained unidentified. The killer remained unknown. Then, nearly a decade after the bodies were first discovered, investigators revealed a new piece of evidence. In 2020, authorities released images of a black leather belt found near one of the crime scenes. Stamped into the leather were the letters HM, or possibly WH. Investigators believed the belt had been handled by the killer. but it did not belong to any of the victims. Police hoped the unusual initials might trigger a memory or tip from the public. But no breakthrough came, and the Long Island serial killer remained unidentified. Then, in 2022, everything changed. A new multi-agency task force was formed to re-examine the case from the beginning. The group brought together investigators from Suffolk County Police, the New York State Police, and the FBI. Using new technology and fresh eyes, the team began reviewing every piece of evidence collected over the previous decade. Phone records were analyzed again. DNA evidence was retested. Witness statements were revisited. Even internet activity connected to the victims was examined in greater detail. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. One clue that had been overlooked for years suddenly became critical. A witness had once described seeing a client pick up one of the victims in a dark green Chevrolet Avalanche pickup truck. At the time, the lead went nowhere, but investigators decided to revisit it. And they began reviewing vehicle registration records across Long Island. Eventually, the search produced a name. The owner of a Chevrolet Avalanche matching the description. A man who lived in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Massapequa Park. A man who worked as an architect in Manhattan. His name was Rex Andrew Hoyerman, and investigators were about to discover that his name had already appeared in the case more than once. As investigators began digging deeper into Rex Hoyerman's life, the task force turned its attention to one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case: the phones. For years, detectives had known that the killer used disposable burner phones to contact several of the victims. These phones were purchased anonymously, used briefly, and then discarded. At the time, the women disappeared. This tactic had made it extremely difficult for investigators to track the person behind the calls, but technology had changed. By the time the task force reopened the case in 2022, analysts had access to far more advanced cellular mapping tools than investigators had a decade earlier. These tools allowed them to examine old phone records in ways that simply had not been possible before. Investigators began reviewing thousands of call logs connected to the victims. Patterns slowly began to emerge. The burner phones used to arrange meetings with the victims did not move randomly through the city. Instead, they followed a pattern that repeated itself over and over again. Each time one of these phones was activated, the signal appeared within a narrow geographic range. And some pings originated near the suburban neighborhood where Rex Hoyerman lived. Other signals appeared close to his office in Manhattan. And on several occasions, the phones were active near the exact locations where victims had last been seen alive. Investigators compared these patterns against years of cellular tower data. The results were striking. Whenever the burner phones contacted one of the victims, the signals almost always appeared within the same overlapping areas tied to Hoyerman's daily routine, near his home, near his office, along the routes he regularly traveled. The pattern repeated too consistently to be dismissed as coincidence. Each new analysis seemed to tighten the web of evidence. But investigators still needed something stronger, something that could place Hoyerman directly at the center of the crimes. That evidence would soon come from a source no one could have predicted: DNA. Years earlier, forensic technicians had collected several hairs from the burlap used to wrap the bodies of the victims. At the time, those hairs had been preserved as potential evidence, but the technology needed to analyze them had been limited. Now, the samples were re-examined. Scientists determined that some of the hairs recovered from the crime scenes contained mitochondrial DNA. Unlike nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA is inherited through the maternal line and can be used to identify family connections. When investigators compared the genetic profile from those hairs against known DNA samples, they made a startling discovery. The DNA matched the mitochondrial profile of Rex Hoyerman's wife. This did not mean she had been involved in the murders. but it suggested something else. The hair may have come from her clothing or belongings and been transferred into the environment where the victims were killed or transported. It suggested that items from the Waterman household may have been present during the crimes. The discovery brought investigators one step closer to their suspect, but prosecutors still needed a direct DNA comparison linking Rex Waterman himself to the evidence. To obtain that sample, detectives began quietly watching him. For days, they followed his movements across New York City. They observed his routines. They watched where he ate, where he walked, where he worked. And eventually, their opportunity arrived. One afternoon, while walking through Manhattan, Waterman stopped to eat a slice of pizza. When he finished, he discarded the crust into a public trash can. Investigators moved quickly. The discarded food was retrieved. Inside the crust was saliva, and inside the saliva was the DNA they needed. Laboratory testing confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The DNA recovered from the pizza crust matched genetic evidence connected to the Gilgo Beach murders. After more than a decade of uncertainty, investigators finally had their suspect. On the evening of July 13, 2023, officers moved in. Rex Waterman was arrested in Manhattan as he walked through the city he had worked in for years. To those who knew him casually, the arrest came as a shock. He was a middle-aged architect, a husband, a father, a man who commuted into Manhattan each day from his quiet home in Massapequa Park. But to investigators, the evidence now painted a very different picture. Within hours of the arrest, the police secured a search warrant for Waterman's home. For nearly 2 weeks, teams of investigators combed through the property. They examined every room, every drawer, every computer file. Digital devices were seized and sent for forensic analysis. Hard drives, cell phones, external storage devices, boxes of documents. Investigators also discovered something else inside the house. Weapons. Hundreds of them. Firearms, ammunition, and other weapons were cataloged as part of the search. Each item was photographed, documented, and examined. Meanwhile, digital forensic specialists began analyzing the massive amount of data recovered from Waterman's devices. What they discovered raised even more disturbing questions. Prosecutors later revealed that Waterman had spent years contacting escorts through various websites and messaging platforms. Records showed he had communicated with numerous women offering escort services. Hundreds of messages were recovered from phones and digital accounts. Investigators also found evidence that he had used aliases when communicating online, sometimes presenting himself under different names. Some of the accounts were connected to dating platforms. Others appeared linked to escort advertisements. But perhaps most unsettling were the searches found within his digital history. Prosecutors stated that investigators discovered searches related to the Gilgo Beach murders themselves. Searches about the victims, searches about the investigation, even searches related to family members of the victims. Authorities argued that these searches suggested a disturbing fascination with the crimes and the people affected by them. To investigators, the pattern suggested predatory behavior that had continued for years. Following the arrest, prosecutors began formally filing charges. At first, Waterman was charged with several of the murders connected to the Gilgo Four. But as the investigation continued, additional charges were added. Eventually, prosecutors announced that Waterman had been charged in connection with 7 murders. Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, and Sandra Costello. The final name on that list revealed something deeply unsettling about the timeline of the case. Sandra Costello had been murdered in 1993. Her death had remained unsolved for decades. Now investigators believed her killing may have been connected to the same suspect tied to the Gilgo Beach murders. And if that connection proved true, it meant the suspected killing spree may have stretched back nearly 17 years, from 1993 to 2010, one of the longest timelines associated with a suspected serial killer in the region. As prosecutors prepared their case, another legal battle began to unfold inside the courtroom. It involved the DNA evidence itself. Scientists had used advanced genetic sequencing methods to analyze the hair samples recovered from the victims. These techniques allowed investigators to build highly detailed genetic profiles, even from extremely small samples. Defense attorneys argued that this technology was too new and should not be admitted in court. They filed motions attempting to block the evidence from being presented during the trial. Prosecutors pushed back, to arguing that the technology was reliable and had been successfully used in other investigations. After reviewing the arguments from both sides, the judge issued a ruling. The advanced DNA sequencing evidence would be allowed. For prosecutors, the decision was a major victory. For the defense, it represented a significant challenge as they prepared for trial. Despite the growing list of charges and the mounting evidence, Rex Heuermann has continued to maintain his innocence. He has pleaded not guilty to all charges brought against him. Legal proceedings surrounding the case have been complex, involving large volumes of digital evidence, forensic reports, and witness testimony. As a result, the trial itself is not expected to begin immediately. Current projections suggest proceedings could begin in late 2026. And legal experts believe the case may become one of the largest and most closely watched serial killer trials in modern American history. But even with the arrest of a suspect, the Gilgo Beach investigation is far from over. Many questions remain unanswered. Investigators still do not know whether every victim discovered along Ocean Parkway is connected to the same killer. Some of the remains discovered in the area may belong to victims of entirely different crimes. Authorities also continue to examine whether additional victims may still be unidentified. The possibility remains that more bodies could be linked to the investigation as forensic technology continues to advance. Another mystery continues to linger over the entire case: the death of Shannan Gilbert. More than a decade after her disappearance, investigators remain divided about whether her death was connected to the Gilgo Beach murders or whether it was a tragic accident. Her family continues to believe she was murdered, and they continue to seek answers. For more than 10 years, the person responsible for the Gilgo Beach killings remained hidden, living a normal life, working in Manhattan, driving home each night to a quiet neighborhood. While along a lonely stretch of highway on Long Island, the victims he is accused of killing remained hidden in the tall grass and dunes. But even now, with a suspect behind bars and a trial on the horizon, investigators believe the full truth about what happened along Gilgo Beach may still be waiting to be uncovered.